Edward Said Memorial Lecture. The title of today's lecture is A Deliberate Cruelty, Rendering Gaza Unviable. A very important and timely subject, and we are very happy to have a distinguished expert on Gaza, Dr. Sara Roy, giving the Edward Said Memorial Lecture today. Dr. Roy is a senior research scholar at the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Harvard University, where she completed her doctoral studies in international development and education. She's trained as a political economist, and she's worked in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank since 1985, conducting research primarily on the economic, social, and political development of the Gaza Strip. And so Dr. Roy is one of the foremost experts on the question of development and specifically in the Gaza Strip. So it's a pleasure to have her here today. And so it is my pleasure at this point to welcome to speak on a deliberate cruelty rendering Gaza unviable, Professor Sara Roy.
I'd like to begin by thanking the Board of Directors of the Jerusalem Fund and its chairman, Dr. Subhi Ali, and the Executive Director of the Palestine Center, Yusuf Minayer, for inviting me to deliver the Edward Said Lecture. I'm deeply honored to do so. Edward and I would always speak about Gaza. In fact, every time we met. He felt a profound connection to the people and the place, and this seemed to be a permanent part of him. Edward had great compassion and great respect for Gaza's people. He embraced their suffering and took pride in their courage and in the way that they were able to move forward. Yet he feared one thing, perhaps most of all, and that is the separation and isolation that now engulfs Gaza and threatens, if it hasn't already, to sever Palestinians there from Palestinians elsewhere, forcing them, in the words of Hannah Arendt, to live outside the common world, deprived of profession and citizenship, without a deed by which to identify or specify themselves. Edward raged against the division of his people and against the kind of loss that such division could bring: disunity, abandonment, and irrelevance. In The Origins of Totalitarianism, Arendt argues that the fundamental deprivation of human rights is expressed first and most powerfully in, quote, the deprivation of a place in the world which makes opinions significant and actions effective. Something much more fundamental than freedom and justice is at stake when belonging to the community into which one is born is no longer a matter of choice, of course, and not belonging no longer a matter of choice. This extremity, and nothing else, she argued, is the situation of people deprived of human rights. They are deprived not of the right to freedom, but of the right to action. End quote. Over the last 45 years, Gaza's trajectory has been striking. From a territory economically integrated into and deeply dependent upon Israel and deeply tied to the West Bank, to an area largely marginalized from Israel and the West Bank, an isolated and disposable enclave subject to consistent military attacks, with which Israel and the West Bank have far fewer formal economic or political ties than they once did. And from a captive economy restricted to fluctuating levels of growth at best, but still possessed of the capacity to produce and innovate within limitations, to an economy increasingly deprived of that capacity, characterized by unprecedented levels of unemployment and impoverishment, with 3/4 of the population requiring some form of humanitarian assistance. These damaging transformations, among others I shall discuss, are becoming increasingly institutionalized and permanent, shaping a future that is both partial and disfigured. What is happening to Gaza is, in my view, catastrophic. It is also deliberate, considered, and purposeful. This lecture will address some of these destructive policies and measures imposed on the Gaza Strip and their economic and social impact. I argue that as a result of these policies, Gaza is being rendered unviable, and by that I mean dispossessed of the capacity for sustainable economic growth and development on the one hand, and increasingly incapable of effecting social change on the other. I'd like to begin by briefly addressing some key contextual transformations or paradigm shifts in the way that Gaza, specifically, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict more generally, is understood. These contextual transformations, which I've written about in greater detail elsewhere, provide, I feel, an important backdrop to the discussion. The first of these paradigm shifts emerges from the policy of separation, which painfully and powerfully defines Gaza, and the denial of territorial contiguity to which it is linked. With the Oslo process, the historical contest over territory was replaced by a policy of separation, isolation, and containment that goes well beyond occupation and is arguably most striking in Gaza. A critical turning point came in 2005 with then Israeli Prime Minister Sharon's so-called disengagement from the Gaza Strip. With this policy, Israel laid the framework for a new unilateral approach that not only ended the pretense of negotiations, it made the separation of the occupied territories a political, economic, and demographic reality. The denial of territorial contiguity derives from an important paradigm shift that views Israel's occupation as normal, manageable, and routine. The steady and rather seamless normalization of the occupation over the last 2 decades in particular has remained unchallenged by the international community, a damaging reality to which it has largely acceded. The normalization of the occupation assumes an extremely compelling form in the Gaza Strip. Unlike the West Bank, where it is seen in the expansion of settlements, in Gaza it is seen in the fact that its status as an occupied territory has ceased to be a matter of international concern, the focus of attention having shifted after Hamas's 2006 electoral victory and 2007 takeover of the Gaza Strip to Gaza's enforced isolation, containment, and punishment. Hence, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been reshaped to center on Gaza and on Israel's hostile relationship with Hamas. Consequently, the occupation has been transformed from a political and legal issue with international legitimacy into a simple border dispute where the rules of armed conflict, not of occupation, apply. This new interpretation has been made explicit in the case of Gaza, and this represents another paradigm shift in the way that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is understood and addressed. The international community, again, has largely come to accept Israel's recasting of its relationship with Gaza from one between occupier and occupied to one between warring parties, facilitating Israeli attacks on Gaza and rendering as illegitimate any notion of human rights or democracy for Palestinians. This recasting is strikingly reflected in critical changes in Israel's economic policy towards Gaza and the West Bank. Whereas previously, policy sought to control and dominate the Palestinian economy, shaping it to Israel's own interests, as it did during the first 2 decades of occupation, current policy attacks the economic structure with the aim of disabling it. Perhaps most striking of all is the transformation of Palestinians, especially in Gaza, from a people with national, political, and economic rights into a humanitarian problem. A demographic presence in an impoverished enclave, unable to mobilize politically and dependent on the goodwill of the international community to provide for them, which is now their primary responsibility. The government of Israel has, in fact, explicitly referred to its intensified closure or siege policy in Gaza as a form of, quote-unquote, economic warfare. The government stated, quote, "Damaging the enemy's economy is in and of itself a legitimate means in warfare and a relevant consideration even while deciding to allow the entry of relief consignments," end quote. This form of warfare is also seen in the termination of the customs code or customs clearance for Gaza needed for imports into the territory and for the imposition of Israeli-imposed or Israeli-controlled buffer zones on Gaza's land and sea, which I will discuss a bit later. All these measures are intentionally designed to undermine and deplete Gaza's economy and productive capacity, measures seldom justified on security grounds. In a November 2008 cable from the U.S. Embassy in Tel Aviv, released by WikiLeaks, U.S. officials wrote, and I quote, "As part of their overall embargo plan against Gaza, Israeli officials have confirmed to U.S. Embassy economic officers on multiple occasions that they intend to keep the Gazan economy on the brink of collapse without quite pushing it over the edge, with the aim of having Gaza's economy functioning at the lowest level possible, consistent with avoiding a humanitarian crisis," end quote. The policy of economic warfare is reflected in another dangerous transformation. Since the assumption of Hamas to power, Israel's goal is no longer simply Gaza's isolation and disablement, but its abstraction and deletion. Israeli policy has shifted from addressing the economy in some manner, whether positively or negatively, to dispensing with the concept of an economy altogether. That is, rather than weaken Gaza's economy through punishing closures and restrictions, as it has long done, the Israeli government imposed an intensified closure or siege that treats the economy as totally irrelevant, a dispensable luxury. The impact of Israel's policy shift is clear in what was until recently the near total collapse of Gaza's private sector, the driver of economic growth, to which I'll return. For some time, it has not been a question of economic growth or development, change or reform, freedom or sovereignty. Rather, for Gaza, the issue is now largely one of essential humanitarian needs, of reducing the needs and rights of 1.65 million people to an exercise in counting truckloads of food. In this way, Israeli policy diverts attention from and in fact justifies the destruction of Gaza's economic infrastructure and productive capacity, goals that were accelerated during Operation Cast Lead. Thus, Gaza's already fragile economy has been transformed from one driven in large part by private sector productivity to one largely dependent on humanitarian assistance and black market trade. And again, I will address these issues shortly. Now I'd like to turn attention to three areas on which are the focus of my talk: Israel's blockade, Gaza's tunnel economy, and the buffer zone. First, the blockade. In its 2011 report on poverty in Gaza and the West Bank, the World Bank revealed the degradation of Palestine's reality, and here I quote from the bank. Following the Second Intifada of 2000, the Palestinian economy began to resemble no other in the world. Limited say over economic policies and trade, the extent of dependence on Israel and international aid, and a regime of internal and external closures, has created an economy characterized by extreme fluctuations in growth and employment and an increasing divergence between the two territories, the West Bank, a fragmented archipelago, and Gaza, an increasingly isolated island. End quote. Despite the many controversies surrounding the Gaza Strip in recent years, the most crucial issue confronting the territory is a ruinous 6-year-long blockade that ended the normal functioning of the economy, especially trade. The blockade has combined severe economic restriction, isolation, and continued military assault to severely undermine Gaza's private sector and productive base, introducing several new and damaging dynamics to a region that is one of the most densely populated in the world, even more densely populated than the city of Tokyo. Historically, the Gaza Strip and West Bank effectively formed a single economy, and the Gaza Strip was considered an indispensable part of the Palestinian economy, accounting for 35% of GDP in 2005. This unity was reflected in the Oslo Accords, and it was also reflected in U.S. policy. Israel and the West Bank combined were Gaza's primary market, and because of this, the ban on the marketing of goods to Israel and the West Bank is the main impediment to sustainable economic development in the Gaza Strip. Although closure has a long history in Gaza, dating back to 1991, restrictions became more acute after 2000 during the Second Palestinian Uprising, and particularly onerous after Hamas's 2007 takeover of the Strip, when the closure was intensified in the form of siege, preventing the import of raw materials and the export of finished products, thus ending normal trade. The impact on the private sector was dramatic. For example, prior to the intensification of the closure, between 54 to 58% of Gaza's employment was generated by the private sector and concentrated in manufacturing, agriculture, construction, and services. Gazan manufacturers imported 95% of their inputs and exported the majority of their finished products to Israel and the West Bank. However, by May of 2009, only 30 to 40 commercial items were allowed to enter Gaza, compared to between 4,000 to 7,000 prior to the blockade. And this number has increased to 400 in May of this year, with virtually none allowed for export. Consequently, between June of 2005 and September of 2008, at least 95% of Gaza's 3,900 industries were forced to close, while the remainder operated far below their capacity. Around 100,000 people out of a benchmark 120,000 benchmark capacity of 120,000 lost their jobs. And this, again, I might remind you, was prior to Operation Cast Lead. Perhaps most critically, Israel's policy of economic warfare virtually banned all exports, which remains the case, and is a major constraint on the manufacturing sector, with, quote, Gaza starkly transforming from a potential trade route to a walled hub of humanitarian donations, wrote the World Bank in September of 2008. For example, the United Nations reported that between January and May of 2007, Gaza exported around 4,800 truckloads, compared with 130 truckloads that it exported between January and May of this year, around 3% of its pre-June 2007 amount. This despite a promise in the 2005 Agreement on Movement and Access, the AMA, to allow 400 truckloads of exports each day. Hence, during the first 6 months of this year, Gaza was allowed to export 1/3 of what the AMA promised as allowable exports for one day. The main exception to the export ban involves a limited number of farmers who have, since 2007, been allowed to export flowers and strawberries to Europe only, part of a program funded by the Dutch government. But by June of this year, the rate of exports from Gaza stood at around 2 to 3% of their pre-June 2007 level. Furthermore, and most important, not one truckload, with certain very minor recent exceptions, has been allowed for export to Israel or the West Bank since June of 2007, which are, of course, Gaza's traditional markets, where demand and profitability are higher, and I might add, despite the fact that Palestinian exports destined for Europe naturally enter Israel and are subject to an intense security screening. According to Gisha and the IMF, Israel has long been blocking a variety of profitable transactions, including furniture orders for Palestinian Authority schools in the West Bank, and recently 1 or 2 of those orders were filled, citrus fruit to West Bank grocers, and textiles to Israeli companies, clearly showing that the restrictions have little, if anything, to do with security and are instead directed at maintaining the separation of Gaza and the West Bank, depriving Gaza and precluding the possibility of a unified Palestinian economy. The current Israeli government has apparently renounced the policy of economic warfare in favor of a policy of separation, which continues to be political rather than a security decision producing the same effect. Thus, normal trade, upon which Gaza's very small economy is extremely dependent, continues to be thwarted and prohibited despite a marginal easing of restrictions on certain imports and exports, which was announced by the Israeli government in June of 2010. And one should not forget that despite a limited relaxation of certain trade restrictions, there has been virtually no change with regard to the movement of people between Gaza, the West Bank, Israel, and the world beyond, confining the overwhelming majority of people in Gaza, including its labor force, to the Strip. While there is no longer a shortage of food, the World Bank states, quote, access to Gaza remains highly controlled, and only consumer goods and construction material for donor-supervised projects are allowed in. Products from Gaza to the West Bank and Israeli markets are prohibited. Only small shipments of certain agricultural and manufactured products are exported to other markets through donor-supported projects. East Jerusalem, which is considered a highly lucrative market, is beyond reach, end quote. In fact, more construction materials have been entering Gaza through the tunnels from Egypt than from Israel. Again, a point I shall return to. A diminished and non-competitive private sector, the inability to trade freely within and outside the Palestinian territories, and severe restrictions on the mobility of labor provide a powerful illustration of economic disablement and the impoverishment it produces. One outcome is high unemployment and persistent unemployment, even in the face of some recent impressive but transient private sector growth. And by June of 2012, unemployment stood near 30% of Gaza's labor force and could easily return to the even higher levels of the previous 2 years, having reached 47% in 2010, according to UNCTAD. The CIA found that the Gaza Strip ranked 17th in terms of unemployment rates, and the West Bank ranked 46th among 196 countries and territories. More significantly, in early 2012, the unemployment rate in Gaza for those aged 15 to 29 years of age was 46.9%. Chronic unemployment, of course, is linked to poverty. Approximately 39% of Gaza's people lived below the poverty line in 2011, double the West Bank rate, a percentage that would be far greater without donor aid. According to UNSCO, this figure reflects no reduction in poverty since 2009, which is very concerning given the impressive growth in real GDP in the period between 2009 and 2011, implying that high economic expansion did not manage to lift people out of poverty. Furthermore, in the absence of any human disaster or shortage of food, approximately 44% of people are food insecure, meaning they do not have access to enough food to meet their dietary needs. This situation obtains despite UN food distributions to over 1 million people and the economy's recent high growth rates. Now I'd like to talk about the tunnels, from the needle to the rocket. The devastating restrictions imposed on Gaza's formal trade lines gave rise to a black market tunnel economy, about which you've no doubt heard. Tunnels have existed in Gaza since the 1980s. Between 2007 and 2008, their numbers mushroomed from a few dozen to 500, with current estimates as high as between 11 and 1,200, although anywhere between 200 to 600 are believed to be operational. The tunnels, which are almost entirely devoted to smuggling goods into Gaza with very limited exports, have become Gaza's primary trading route, a critical lifeline for and driver of the local economy, allowing it to mitigate some of the worst pressures imposed by the blockade. By 2012, the tunnel economy with and via Egypt had become Gaza's principal economic engine, accounting for 80 to 90% of its trade, which was valued at close to $700 million annually, and for the marked increases in private sector employment, to which I alluded earlier. Nicholas Pelham, who has written extensively on the tunnel economy, similarly observed, and I quote, "All told, the tunnels have kick-started Gaza's reconstruction, propelling it out of the darkest days of the siege. Imports have triggered a building boom, and Gaza resembles a vast construction site." End quote. Once Gaza's smuggling trade began to assume more formal commercial dimensions, the Hamas government moved to regulate it, establishing a regulatory authority known as the Tunnel Affairs Commission, translating what was, quote, once a tax-free enterprise to escape closures into a source of domestic revenue, end quote. In its drive to formalize the economy, the Hamas government, writes Pelham, established an increasingly comprehensive customs regime, providing it with a new revenue base that partially compensated for the Ramallah-based PA's monopoly on customs revenues collected at Israeli ports. I will not list all the fees imposed, they are considerable, except to say that these taxes on tunnel goods have proven to be extremely lucrative for the Hamas government. For example, according to Omar Shaban, an economist in the Gaza Strip, who studies the tunnel trade, the government levies the following taxes: 50 cents on every liter of gas, with 500,000 liters brought in daily; 80 cents on each of the 300,000 packs of cigarettes that enter Gaza each day; $15 on every ton of construction steel, with 300 tons entering every day, and $10 per ton of cement, with 2,000 tons imported daily. These four commodities alone yield the Hamas government an annual income of $188 million. And the other fees that I'm not going to list, because there are too many, contribute to this quite dramatically. Hamas also regulates many types of businesses, from street vendors to Gaza's 20 money-changing companies, by requiring them to pay license fees. Taxes are also collected on a variety of luxury items, such as cars coming in from Israel, in order to compensate for lost tunnel income after 2010, when imports from Israel increased. In fact, import taxes on tunnel goods allowed the government to raise over half of its $750 million 2011 annual budget locally, while the tunnel trade generated rising levels of employment, especially in the construction sector, and improved some of Gaza's public infrastructure, including government buildings, police stations, and mosques. The Gaza-Rafah highway was widened, I hesitate to call it a highway, while parks and coastal areas were beautified. In fact, the tunnel economy as a whole was, at its peak, according to Pelham, Gaza's largest non-governmental employer and its largest employer of youth, with some 5,000 tunnel operators and 25,000 workers supporting some 150,000 people, which is close to about 10% of Gaza's total population. An extremely crucial aspect of the tunnel trade is its size, which has dwarfed official trade with Israel, outstripping formal trade supplies. For example, by February of 2012, a monthly average of 1,600 tons of cement came through Israeli crossings compared to 31,000 tons received through the tunnels. More strikingly, Pelham reports that by mid-2011, 3,000 tons of cement entered Gaza daily. Hence, in one day, the tunnels could supply nearly double the amount of cement that Israel delivered in 1 month. This, in turn, has catalyzed a building boom addressing Gaza's desperate need for housing, with large-scale investment from the Saudi Development Bank, Turkey, and Qatar. The impact of the tunnel economy, coupled with Israel's easing of import restrictions, has been dramatic. According to the UN, as in 2010, construction activity was the single most important element in private sector growth in both territories. In 2010 and 2011, Gaza's annual average real GDP growth surpassed 20% and boasted a stunning 23% gain in 2011 alone, admittedly built on a very depressed, devastated economic base, which resulted from closure. The number of people working in construction more than tripled between 2010 and 2011, and overall employment in Gaza grew nearly 25% relative to 2010. It is clear that the tunnel trade is now the principal catalyst behind Gaza's booming construction sector and GDP growth, precipitating Gaza's post-war reconstruction, while the donor community remained on the sidelines. Consequently, according to Robert Seri, the UN's Middle East Peace Process Coordinator, commerce in Gaza is now controlled by, quote, smugglers and militants, end quote, rather than by international agencies and local contractors who wish to produce goods entering through legitimate channels, which have been crippled by Israel's blockade policies. Hence, international organizations, foreign businesses, and local businesses, and the local business sector who use established trade routes remain relatively weakened and often unable to compete with Gaza's underground trade despite an easing of restrictions by Israel, which by one local account quadrupled the number of trucks from Israel permitted to bring goods to Gaza. And this also despite an increase in donor-supervised public works projects. This has crushed Gaza's commercial class, which has comparatively fewer economic assets and increased the population's dependence on the Hamas government. Yet, although Gaza's GDP was driven by higher construction, commerce, consumption, and foreign aid, the productive, labor-intensive industrial and agricultural sectors of the economy benefited little from the enormous wealth being generated in the Strip. One critical illustration is seen in the low level of investment in the economy, around 9% of Gaza's GDP in 2011, with little directed to plant, equipment, and other productive inputs. Rather, investment is increasingly directed towards residential construction and land where speculation and profits are high. Thus, strong GDP growth did not contribute to a strengthened capacity for future production and employment. The tunnels have allowed Hamas to consolidate its hold on the territory, circumvent U.S.-led international financial restrictions, and in effect build its own economic system. This is no doubt one reason why the Ramallah PA has called upon the Egyptian government to destroy all the tunnels. Yet the tunnel trade is under some threat following the incident in the Sinai this past August that resulted in the death of 16 Egyptian soldiers. In response, the Egyptian army destroyed 120 tunnels, around 10% of the total, and temporarily closed the Rafah crossing, which surprised the Hamas government. In response, Hamas proposed a free trade zone on the border as an alternative to the tunnel trade, which President Morsi recently rejected, leaving the tunnels the main source of goods into Gaza. There is more to say about the Egyptian-Gaza or Egyptian-Hamas relationship in this regard, but for now, suffice it to say that the status quo, with limited changes, will continue given that Egypt suspended the tunnel destruction process soon after it began. The Rafah crossing has been reopened with extended hours, and the hopes are to increase the amount of traffic or of Gazans entering Egypt daily to 1,500 from an average of 450 daily entrants between 2011 and 2012. Clearly, there are many problems with the tunnel trade which make it unsuitable for rehabilitating the productive sectors, according to the Israeli human rights group Gisha, which monitors conditions in the Gaza Strip. Trade, first of all, is vulnerable to closure or attack by Israel and Egypt and to political and economic conditions in both countries, as we've seen. Trade is overwhelmingly one way. Goods are of low quality. Supply is unpredictable, as seen in the ongoing fuel crisis in which Egypt has curtailed its fuel supplies to Gaza because of its own domestic shortages. Transit costs are high, and there is always the risk of damage to goods, although Hamas has tried to respond to that problem. Also, international organizations working in Gaza on a range of projects cannot purchase anything through the tunnels given their linkage to the Hamas government. Furthermore, increased construction activity, itself limited by the small size of Gaza's market, cannot serve as a basis for future economic growth. In fact, some analysts predict that the boom that we are currently seeing will not last beyond 2 years, as most buildings will be completed and the housing stock restored. What then? Other distortions have arisen as well. At least 2 new economic classes have emerged in Gaza, a phenomenon with precedence in the Oslo period. The first and arguably the most prominent is a new mercantile elite of black market traders and merchants that has grown extremely wealthy from the tunnel economy, providing them with a form of upward mobility unimaginable just years before. In Gaza today, there are reportedly over 850 millionaires and 1,600 near millionaires, in quotation marks, who owe their fortunes to the new economic order and likely have little incentive to change it. This creates an economic anomaly in which productive sectors are greatly diminished, while a small segment of beneficiaries enjoy amazing growth. Furthermore, Pelham states, the tunnel economy has created vested interests between Sinai's Bedouin traders, transporters, and tunnel owners and Gaza's consumers, which will not easily be decoupled. The second class consists of certain public sector employees, approximately 60,000, civil servants and security personnel hired before 2007, who are paid not to work for the Hamas government by the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. According to the UN, PA support to Gaza in the form of these salaries, as well as medical supplies and other expenses, is estimated to amount to $1 billion a year. Since the PA is unable to collect taxes in Gaza and the tax revenue it collects on Gaza's imports is minimal, most of the PA's expenditures in Gaza are being financed by international aid. And this is the key sentence. Gaza is thus basically being kept alive through external funding in the form of aid and remittances and the illegal tunnel economy. End quote. However, these salary subventions, together with payments to the UN for over 10,000 local staff, amount to $65 million each month, and this has sustained Gaza's liquidity and purchasing power. Both these phenomena have led to social and economic disparities between the haves and overwhelming majority of have-nots that are not only vast but visible, as seen in the almost perverse consumerism in restaurants and shops that is a singular domain of the nouveau riche and wealthy. Increased spending power has led to further distortions. Since the rich can only invest locally, land prices on the coast have risen dramatically, as have real estate prices, which are reported to have increased by 300%. In fact, the rise in real estate prices is so spectacular that property per square meter in Gaza's largest refugee camp, Jabalia, is reportedly nearly equivalent to prices in Tel Aviv, while Rafah is apparently more expensive than Cairo. Without doubt, the 6-year-long blockade, coupled with Operation Cast Lead, have introduced an institutionalized dynamics that have undermined Gaza's formal economy in favor of a pseudo official black market that is becoming increasingly formal in an environment where donor aid is the principal driver of the economy, reducing economic behavior to its lowest common denominator, consumption. Although the tunnel trade can and should be understood as a form of empowerment and self-sufficiency, providing critically needed goods and jobs in an extremely adverse environment, it still represents a dangerous and increasingly damaging reconfiguration of economic activity, despite the growth in output and employment it has generated. Gaza's tunnel economy was, as Pelham argues, a remedial answer to the blockade, not an economic solution. Because of this, its multiplier effects, including increases in private sector employment, cannot begin to compensate for the decline of the formal economy as seen in the virtual end of export trade and the attendant erosion of the manufacturing and agricultural sectors. This is why, despite the recent growth in Gaza's GDP, it remains below its level in 2005 and even in 1994. As Oxfam observes, the scale of economic activity remains dependent on local demand in Gaza, which in turn is constrained by low purchasing power of the population and the relatively small size of the local market. Again, underlining the critical need of Gaza's small, resource-strapped economy for access to external markets. Furthermore, by bounding Gaza's economy in this way, which propels Gaza toward a still less than welcoming Egypt, Israel is able to further deepen the separation and isolation of the occupied territories and prevent the emergence of a Palestinian state, which is Israel's primary goal. Gaza is removed as an integral part of Palestine, eliminating any possibility of a larger Palestinian economy capable of sustained growth and development, which could support a sovereign Palestinian state and compete with Israel. The result, said Meron Ben-Veniste nearly 10 years ago, will be a state that is, quote, limited to the height of its residential buildings and the depth of its graves, end quote. Debilitating Gaza's economy is the key to debilitating Palestine's. As a colleague in Gaza so powerfully put it to me, he said, quote, "The world has long gone airborne and has increasingly gone wireless. The world's economy has become borderless and virtual, and here we are, digging ourselves into the sand," end quote. Now the buffer zone and the despoliation of the agricultural sector. It is perhaps in Gaza's agricultural sector that Israel's intentions are most visible and Gaza's unviability most striking. Gaza's agricultural sector, once an important part of the economy, has been severely degraded, if not effectively destroyed. The virtual ban on Gaza's exports that I've already discussed have acted, of course, as a severe constraint on agricultural output and employment. However, there are other reasons for the sector's dramatic decline. One factor, a key factor, is the buffer zone, or access restricted area, ARA, that has been unilaterally imposed by Israel on the Gaza Strip's land and sea since the start of the Second Palestinian Uprising in September of 2000 and gradually widened over time. Buffer zone areas are totally or partially inaccessible to Palestinians. The most striking data are these. The now extended buffer zone, identified by the UN as a hazard and dangerous zone, extends 1 kilometer in length, which is well beyond the 300 meters originally designated by Israel. What this means, consequently, is that nearly 14% of Gaza's total land area is taken up by the buffer zone, and it also encompasses approximately 48% of Gaza's total arable land. And you should remember that the most arable land in the Gaza Strip is along and within the buffer zone. Indeed, the UN reports that buffer zone restrictions result in an annual loss of about 75,000 metric tons of potential produce, which translates roughly into just under 83,000 tons, U.S. tons. Similarly, the extended buffer zone in the sea covers 85% of the maritime area promised to Palestinians in the Oslo Accords. Hence, 20 nautical miles has been reduced to 3 nautical miles. In fact, it was during Cast Lead that both the arable land and maritime area suffered their greatest losses. In order to enforce the buffer zone, which Palestinian armed groups have used against Israeli targets, the IDF has used a variety of violent means, including incursions and land leveling operations. According to Al-Haq, land incursions into the buffer zone occur an average of 3 to 4 times every week. In 2011, the Israeli army engaged in at least 69 land leveling operations and incursions that took place beyond the 300-meter limit, which has damaged Gaza's topsoil and prime agricultural areas. Incursions have resulted in damage to civilian infrastructure, homes, schools, water and sanitation facilities, a water reservoir, and a newly built sewage pump station. Land leveling operations, however, have raised concerns among some analysts and scientists that go well beyond immediate damage and loss, suggesting a policy that may be concealing a greater outrage. For the leveling of land is not only about the destruction of agricultural crops and restricting access to food, but also about what is being done to the soil itself. Let me explain. In the final days of cast-lead, 200 bulldozers inflicted much, if not most, of the destruction. 7,847 acres of agricultural land, of citrus trees, other fruit-bearing trees, vegetation, nurseries, farms, so on and so forth, were bulldozed and flattened by tanks and tracked vehicles moving back and forth, compacting the soil. 5,000 acres were flattened inside the buffer zone, and 2,847 acres were damaged or destroyed throughout the 16 sub-districts of the Gaza Strip. Combined, these areas account for around 1/3 of Gaza's total arable land that is now totally out of production. And the total damage, I might add, imposed on the agricultural sector by cast-lead is in excess of $250 million. Now, the bulldozing of land and the compaction of soil raises a potentially serious problem, because it creates a situation that forces farmers to deplow. However, deplowing without sufficient irrigation, which remains a problem, a very serious problem in the buffer zone, due to the destruction of groundwater wells, which are the main source of irrigation, will turn the land into a non-arable dust bowl. Non-arability is further exacerbated by the suspected toxicities of some soils, resulting from their saturation by chemicals, sewage, and possible weapon debris. In fact, by deep plowing in this way, Palestinian farmers are contributing to the soil's destruction, unwittingly or not. The resulting desertification process will, in the absence of any remedial measures, ensure that the land becomes irredeemable waste. The Israeli authorities reportedly refuse access to the land for soil testing, nor will they allow farmers to import pumps which could be used to repair damaged agricultural wells. According to local sources in Gaza, the land area between Beit Hanun and the northern strip and the Israeli border fence is now 80% devastated. Given the enormous losses in arable land and fishing area, which may grow wider in the future, and the other restrictions imposed, it is not unreasonable to conclude, as the UN Environmental Program has, that Gaza's agricultural economy, quote, may indeed be finished, end quote. Another critical constraint on agriculture, on the economy, and on people, of course, is water. Water is an extremely serious problem and has been for decades due to overpumping of the coastal aquifer, allowing seawater to enter and pollute fresh water, a problem made worse by the unlicensed and unregulated drilling of more than 4,000 wells by Palestinians. On a visit to Gaza in the summer of this year, Martha Myers, who's the Director of Relief and Social Services for UNRWA, commented on the quality of domestic water. She said, quote, "It's not like drinking seawater, it is drinking seawater." The aquifer has also been contaminated by decades of infiltration by sewage and agricultural fertilizer. Due to the breakdown of Gaza's sanitation infrastructure, the sewage flow in the Gaza Strip, together with other contaminants leaching from waste dumps, have led to elevated levels of nitrates and chlorides in the groundwater and soil, which pose a serious risk to humans and to livestock. Since 2008, between 60,000 and 90,000 cubic meters of untreated or partially treated sewage enter the environment or the Mediterranean Sea daily. In 2012, 25% of this wastewater, 30,000 cubic meters, has been treated and reused in some form for agricultural purposes, while 90,000 cubic meters of raw or partially treated sewage is released into the environment daily. This is the equivalent of 23,775,500 gallons of sewage being dumped into the environment every day. A 2009 UNICEF and Palestinian Hydrology Group study reported that, quote, concentrations of chloride and nitrate, which is a component in fertilizer and is found in human and animal waste, are as much as 10 times the safe levels established by WHO. EWASH, which is an NGO representing over 30 organizations working in water and sanitation and hygiene in the West Bank and Gaza, EWASH similarly argues that most of the Gaza Strip contains groundwater where the nitrate concentration is well above the acceptable WHO level, finding that, quote, 90% of water wells are contaminated with nitrates between 2 and 8 times higher than WHO standards. Remedial actions are largely prevented by Israel's blockade policy, which limits and prevents the entry of materials needed to repair, maintain, and upgrade Gaza's sewage, wastewater treatment, and storage infrastructure, which is unable to cope with demand or lacks sufficient fuel. In fact, less than 20% of the needed materials for essential water and sanitation projects that would alleviate many of the problems faced in Gaza have been allowed in through the Israeli-controlled crossing 2 years after Israel announced the easing of the blockade in 2010. In 2011, furthermore, Save the Children Foundation reported that airstrikes destroyed $1.3 million worth of water and sanitation infrastructure, including a new sewage pumping station connecting 130,000 people in El Nuseirat and Burej to the main sewage system. They also found that 1.1 million Gazans in nearly half of Gaza's municipalities are at high risk of consuming biologically contaminated drinking water from private vendors, which is the principal source of water for most Gaza residents. Bacteriological contamination was found in 63% of households sampled. Furthermore, the compound problem of Gaza's depleted aquifer, a lack of proper sewage treatment and disposal system, and the difficulties of providing adequate service delivery have produced a grave environmental situation with significant health risks, end quote. According to ANIRA, 26% of disease in Gaza is water-related. It is not unreasonable to assume that water and soil contamination may become chronic and possibly irreversible as long as the blockade denies the importation of essential inputs needed to address the problem. The internal findings of another donor agency concluded, quote, nowhere else in the world has such a large number of people been exposed to such high levels of nitrates for such a long period of time. There is no precedent and no studies to help us understand what happens to people over the course of years of nitrate poisoning, end quote. I'd like to turn my attention now briefly to some issues of social decline. And here I'd like to turn this on. Clearly, and here what I'm going to do is address some issues regarding the health of the population and the impact of a diminishing economy on social attitudes. Clearly, the health of the economy and the environment will determine the health and well-being of people and vice versa. For example, it is not surprising that Gaza's worsening economic and environmental conditions combined with high fertility and high population growth rates have resulted in rising malnutrition among Palestinian children below the age of 5. Between 2000 and 2010, the prevalence of malnutrition rose by 41.3% nationally and 60% in the Gaza Strip. Stunting, which is low height for age, which is an indicator of chronic malnutrition, has become increasingly frequent among Gaza's children under 5, affecting 9.9% of them in 2010. According to the Palestinian Central Bureau of Statistics, children in Gaza are twice as likely to live in poverty as children in the West Bank. Nutritional deficiencies, particularly vitamins A and D, are high among Gazan children, under 3, due in part to diarrheal infections that are linked to the lack of access to clean water. In addition, states EWASH the prevalence of anemia due to dietary iron deficiency is so high that it indicates a severe public health problem according to the WHO classification system. Between 68 and 74% of infants 9 to 12 months of age suffer from anemia, as do 59% of school children and 37% of pregnant women. According to the WHO, the most serious consequences of anemia include poor pregnancy outcome, impaired physical and cognitive development, increased risk of morbidity in children, and reduced work productivity in adults. Anemia contributes to 20% of all maternal deaths. A 2012 report by Save the Children stated, and I quote, excuse me, diseases of poverty and conflict combined with a degenerating healthcare system are claiming growing numbers of Gaza's children, end quote. There is rising concern among Palestinian and European specialists with regard to the reproductive health of Gaza's population, a reported rise in the number of birth defects and congenital anomalies after OCL, the increase in the number of abortions, and a reported increase in the incidence of cancer after CAS-led. This is due not only to soil and water contamination, but also to the possible use of toxic weaponry during the war. Although this area of research remains inconclusive and highly contentious, one European military analyst told me that 55 tons of munitions were dropped on Gaza City in 3 weeks of the 2008 invasion. The deep penetrating munitions, he said, used to destroy some tunnels along Gaza's southern border were so destructive that part of the city of Rafah began to sink. He also revealed that witnesses further stated that following these attacks, IDF engineers entered the area and replaced the topsoil. Such an action may have been intended to prevent possible depleted uranium-impregnated dust from being carried into the territories of southern Israel by the prevailing westerly winds, end quote. Another expert privately indicated that although the available data are still incomplete, they suggest the possibility that the number of birth deformities in Gaza will rise quite dramatically or in a manner that is statistically significant, possibly as soon as 2014. Although the requirement for validity is very high and perhaps impossible to prove, the concerns raised are real and not without foundation. Now, interviews with colleagues and friends in Gaza revealed some common themes regarding the ways in which social attitudes have been affected by Gaza's altered economic reality, attitudes which will no doubt impact Gaza's future. There is real concern that professionals and academics unable to travel abroad for training in higher education will lose their skills and expertise. According to the Portland Trust, which is a British NGO working in economic development, the longer the situation continues, the greater the risk of an irreplaceable loss which could take more than a generation to recover, end quote. Severed from the outside world, the position of women has also weakened in Gaza's increasingly conservative society. One indicator is found in rising levels of domestic violence. According to the PCBS, 51% of all married women reported being abused by their husbands over the last year. Women, more of whom have economic responsibilities outside the home, remain the primary caretaker of their families and must confront on a daily basis the very practical consequences of a terribly compromised reality: the lack of access to clean water, nutritious food, medical care, and education, poor housing, and insufficient electricity, among many other problems. Another prominent concern centers on what happens to a once productive and motivated population who have been forced into a state of non-productivity, of near total dependence on humanitarian aid for basic subsistence. This deprivation is deliberate and imposed on a people desperate and able to work. Although some resist and seek creative ways to move forward, others do not. And I'd like to quote from a colleague and friend of mine in Gaza who had this to say, which I found very compelling. He said, quote, "Tens of thousands continue to receive a salary from the PA in Ramallah for doing nothing, while the government in Gaza has been paying other tens of thousands, most of whom have been hired to replace those who were ordered by the PA to stay at home. Hundreds of thousands continue to receive humanitarian aid from UNRWA and other donors just to keep their heads above water. The rest have no one to look out for them, except private generous citizens and NGOs. In virtually none of these cases does one see any attempt to exploit people's potential to work, produce, and earn their living through, even though people in Gaza want to do so, and they're eager to do so. All those who intervene in Gaza, the PA, local authorities, the UN, and others, are in effect acquiescing to this reality. No one seems to properly challenge the political or economic aspects of internal division and of Israel's successive policies of keeping Gaza alive but constantly needy and isolated, unable to earn its own living, even though it very well could." Now, I'd like to just continue for 5 more minutes, and then I'll conclude. In this regard, not only are Israel and donor governments culpable, but so too are the Palestinian Authority governments in Gaza and the West Bank, whose internal power struggle for power, especially over the flow of humanitarian assistance and the movement of humanitarian aid workers, further diminish the possibility of economic reform. And last is a theme that has been constant in my work since it began 27 years ago, the assault on human dignity, and now its seeming absence. Dr. Rajai Batniji, a Stanford University physician, wrote a powerful essay in the British medical journal The Lancet about a recent trip to his family in Gaza, in which he echoes Hannah Arendt's observations with which I began this lecture. He writes, "Gaza is something of a laboratory for observing an absence of dignity. The violations of dignity include not being seen or being incompletely seen, being subsumed into a group identity, invasion of personal space, including physical violence, and humiliation. The constant surveillance from the sky, collective punishment through blockade and isolation, the intrusion into homes and communications, and restrictions on those trying to travel or marry or work make it difficult to live a dignified life in Gaza," end quote. In fact, during the period between February 2009 and August of 2012, 1,059 incidents against Gaza took place, an average of 6 incidents a week. They were generally of 4 kinds: attacks by aircraft and helicopter gunships, drones, and tanks throughout Gaza, even in densely populated areas; attacks against fishermen involving the confiscation of or damage to their fishing boats and other equipment and the detention and arrest of fishermen; attacks on industrial, farm, and food production facilities and related infrastructure; and ground incursions by the IDF into Gaza's buffer zone and Gaza proper. And Batniji continues, "It is not just the Israeli occupation and siege that are at fault, but the internal power struggles among Palestinians, which has recreated many of the most threatening aspects of the Israeli occupation, including barriers to movement of people and goods, isolation, and torture. To these divisions add the exigencies of daily life, which force people to hoard fuel and other necessities and depend disproportionately on foreign assistance to eat. It is then no surprise that many people on the street now walk with their heads down, whether it is out of fear, isolation, or a loss of dignity, intentionally neglecting the destruction that surrounds them," end quote. The words of a 17-year-old boy detained in an Israeli prison captures the essence of life in Gaza. "What it feels like to live here, you ask? It's like being a shadow of your own, caught on the ground, not being able to break out, and you see yourself lying there, but you cannot fill the shadow with light." Palestinians in the Gaza Strip are entrapped in what Professor Nadara Shahub-Kevorkian of Hebrew University terms, quote, "a zone of non-existence," end quote. In this zone, she argues, one finds new spaces of obscenity in the politics of day-to-day lives, where engaging in normal, everyday acts of living and working, going to school, visiting neighbors, traveling abroad, planting a tree, growing vegetables, or selling goods in a nearby market, are treated as criminal activities, punishable in some cases by death. In these obscene spaces, innocent human beings, the majority of them children, are slowly being poisoned by the water they drink, all with the knowledge and seeming acquiescence of the world community. This disfigurement of everyday life is, for me as a Jew, painfully symbolized in the Star of David that was gouged into Gaza's soil during Israel's 2008 war on the territory. Yet the desecration, of the land in this way not only points to the destruction of a way of life and means of survival for Palestinians, it embodies the limitations of Israeli power and the failings of Jewish life as well. No doubt those who wrested the Star of David from Gaza's soil meant to convey the presence and the power of the Jewish state over the destiny of others. Yet this power is one of deprivation and ruin, and it speaks profoundly to our own inability to live a life without the walls we are constantly asked to build. As I've hopefully shown, the people of Gaza are being deliberately targeted and a crime against them is being committed. More than anything, this crime is found in the daily and unrelenting assault on their economy and society, for which the United States, the European Union, and various Arab states bear enormous responsibility together with Israel. Whether you deliberately shoot a human being through the heart with a bullet, or deprive him of a home, livelihood, and the means to take care of his children, you are saying to that human being that he has no right to exist. In this way, among others, Gaza speaks to the unnaturalness of our own condition as Jews. For in Gaza, we seek remedy and consolation in the ruin of another people, observing the windows of their houses through the sights of rifles, to borrow from the Israeli poet Almog Bihar. It is ironic, then, that our own salvation, in my view, now lies in Gaza's, and no degree of distance or separation will ever change that. Thank you.
I'm Tom Getman, a former NGO executive. I worked in Gaza. There's not a person in this room that doesn't make the connection to another historical moment. What can we do to get this word out? Have you distributed this? Even the Jewish man has alluded to the parallels. Is there a way we can get this out without being called right away anti-Semites?
Okay. Gentleman here. Just one second, sir, for the microphone.
Thank you so much. My name is Oscar Ordenes. I'm with the Fellowship of Reconciliation and the New Sanctuary Movement. First of all, thank you again to the Palestine Center for an unbelievable talk, and of course to the speaker. Thank you, Doctor. My question is the following. Considering that the picture is extremely dark, if we think only of Palestine and Israel, and if I may enlarge the picture, you know that there was an effort to democratize the Security Council of the United Nations because it is a monopoly of the five powers. And
we do need to get to a question.
Okay, I think that explains the paralysis by the international community. Is there an effort still to democratize the United Nations and to make the General Assembly more pertinent in relation to the Security Council now, which might mean something positive for Palestine? Thank you.
Thank you. And lady right here in the second row, just one moment, wait for a microphone, then we'll get a response from our guest. Go ahead.
There's obviously no incentive to invest in Gaza, probably, but I just wondered, are there restrictions and embargoes on investing by the United States or other things in Gaza? And is there any possibility of developing things like call centers for, internet activity?
Okay. Well, these two questions, in effect, are similar. I personally don't know of any movement to democratize the Security Council, but it leads to a general point, and that is that it is absolutely essential, in my view, to educate people more and more on this issue, and to educate them with facts and with real hard data and analysis, of course. The positions of power obviously are, the sources of power are positioned against Gaza and against Palestinians generally. However, having said that, I was just having this conversation with Yusuf earlier. The discourse has opened up in this country, and the terrain for addressing this issue openly, publicly, and critically has changed dramatically in the last 10 to 15 years for all kinds of reasons that I won't get into now. And so I think one has to take advantage of that, and to do so in a manner that is thoughtful, that is careful, that is analytical, that is fact-based, and that also attempts to bring like-minded people from all sides together, including mobilizing members of the Jewish community in this country, and the progressive Jewish community has grown by leaps and bounds. Bring in those many, many Israelis who are trying to change the situation from inside Israel, to build coalitions, to build alliances. I think it's very important to keep that in mind, to bring in people who want to help from a variety of groups and cross-sections. And I think this is the time to do it. I do believe it. I've been involved in this issue for a very long time. And when I started, there was no venue, really, in this country for speaking publicly and critically on this issue and criticizing policy. Of course, that has changed dramatically. With regard to your point, first of all, because of the U.S. Embargo on financial transactions and whatnot, no U.S. company, organization, or any kind of group can invest in Gaza right now without running the risk of sanctions or legal action. In fact, as I said in my talk, a lot of donor governments, especially USAID, cannot deal with Hamas at all, with the Hamas government, and they can't deal with any kind of traffic goods, deal with any kind of commodities that come through the tunnels. And so the kinds of vetting procedures that AID, for example, puts their contractors through, and they themselves go through, consumes an enormous amount of time and effort and money that should be used for development-related work, but this is part of the reality. And yes, if people want to invest from other countries, they, of course, can do so, but nobody's going to invest in an environment that is so politically unstable and economically insecure. Very few investors would do that. So the situation in Gaza precludes that. In fact, Hamas is simply trying to keep services alive and to provide relief and keep people above water. They can't even think in terms of investment or development or those kinds of long-term things under these conditions. Not that they might want to anyway, I don't know. But within the current set of constraints, it's just not possible.
We'll just do one final round of questions. We're only going to take 3, and we'll have Professor Roy respond to all of them.
Basically, I just want to ask, is your paper published? This presentation, can we get access to it so that...
Well, I'll take that one really quick.
Yeah.
The transcript and the video of this lecture today will be available in the next day or so on our website. The video will be available immediately, and then the transcript shortly after that. Yeah, and in a couple days, but the video will certainly be up immediately after this talk. So, gentlemen, right here, just wait for the microphone for a moment, sir.
I'm Dr. Saeed, retired surgeon. You spoke about the tunnel from Egypt to Gaza. How do they pay back? What product Gaza makes that can chicken export to Egypt? And if they really need to export, shouldn't the rich people who make money out of the tunnels encourage manufacturing to pay back for what they import through the tunnel from Egypt?
Okay, and we'll take one more right there.
Thank
Keep your
you.
question brief, sir.
Thank you, Benjamin Tua. To what extent are these findings and similar findings being brought to the attention of top U.S. government officials such as the Secretary of State by experts and such as yourself, as well as doctors and heads of NGOs who are knowledgeable in this area?
Well, I'll start with that question first. I can't really answer that. I don't know. I can tell you, I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to that. I can tell you just based on my own personal experience. I have people, colleagues, friends in different parts of the government that are very open on a one-to-one to discussing this. Beyond that, I don't know to what degree this information is disseminated. I suspect it is. I'm not sure that the problem is lack of information. I think it's the indifference to it that one finds.
200 experts and leading citizens for the rights of the Secretary of State published that letter in the New York Times. I think it did get attention.
Well, I remember there was a letter that several years ago, in fact, I wrote about it and included it in one of my articles, in which a number of congresspeople signed a letter saying that, you know, the blockade, the siege is really damaging. It's damaging to Palestinians. It's damaging U.S. interests, and so this, which was rather dramatic thing to have happened, given that it was signed by, I forget how many congressmen, but not a huge number, but a reasonable number. And it had, you know, momentary flash, and then it disappeared. I think the issue really is not a lack of information. I believe our government is extremely well informed about the problems and issues. It's trying to find a way to move that government, given the many constraints that we're all aware of, to try to change policy in a way that is humane, if nothing else.
Thank you. I agree, and that there's a difference between providing information and publicity about it.
Point taken. We're going to try to respond to the final question before we wrap, which was
yes, the exports. First of all, the exports, and they're very, very few and very limited. The tunnel trade is basically about imports from Egypt into Gaza. And there are a certain number of exports. I know that, I can't remember all of them, but some of them are exports of Israeli products, re-exports. They're Israeli products that enter Gaza and then are re-exported to Egypt because there's a demand for them inside Egypt. But again, the numbers, as I understand them, are very, very low. And the issue isn't just on the side of Gaza. The issue is on the side of Egypt, okay? Because one thing I didn't get into and didn't have time to get into was the very tense relationship between the Hamas government and the Egyptian government right now, and particularly over the border and the establishment, not just of the tunnels, but there was talk of a free trade zone, and that was rejected by President Morsi, not surprisingly, because there are a lot of other levels, political issues and legal issues at stake here. So it's not a conduit through which a viable trade in export could occur, unless, of course, the Egyptians were willing to really treat this as a legitimate and legal activity. And also remember, if this were to happen, Israel could then argue that if Gaza and Egypt establish a legitimate legal trading route, either via Rafah, which the Hamas government wants, an opening up of Rafah not only for humanitarian goods and people, but for commerce, this would abrogate the treaty between the existing treaty between Hamas, Egypt, Israel, and the U.S. about what the Rafah border is about. And if that were to be abrogated, then Israel could argue, well, then we're sealing all our borders. Gaza has a legitimate trading route with Egypt and beyond. This separates Gaza and the West Bank, divides the Palestinians, severs any notion of or any possibility of a unified Palestinian economy. and creates a very, very different and, let us say, challenging situation. And I think the last thing that President Morsi wants to do right now is displease the U.S. or Israel by legitimizing economic, legal, or political relationship, or enhancing, I should say, an economic, legal, or political relationship with Hamas.
Professor Roy, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you.